Continuing, 6th grade. Our 6th grade lay teacher was Mrs. Combs. She was another small in stature lay teacher who was generally nice to us students. She had straight brown hair that sloppily covered much of her face, which was pockmarked a bit, no doubt from a teenage problem with acne. Once Mrs. Combs got sick and had to be out of school for a while. A substitute teacher led our class for that time, and he was a man. I think it was the first male lay teacher we had. He was fun to learn from. Then, as fast as he came to our class, he was gone, and Mrs. Combs was back. For some reason, I had to talk about this out loud. She asked if all of us missed her, and we collectively said yes. Then I blurted out, yes, but the substitute teacher was fun. Mrs. Combs heard that and suddenly got sullen. When asked what was wrong, she said someone just hurt her feelings. The whole class looked at me, and I said, what? I didn't do anything wrong. So without directly addressing me or the problem she suddenly had, the room slowly had come down from this tension. And she was a fairly popular teacher, but I didn't like her. The class made me feel bad about it, too. Our other teacher for 6th grade was not a nun. This was rare. She was Mrs. Hull, a tall, skinny, and demure woman. She seemed depressed all the time, too. It must have been just her nature, since she never changed for that whole year. The presidential election had just happened one day, and I bravely asked Mrs. Hull who she voted for. Without hesitation, she said Jimmy Carter. I immediately felt a connection with her, even if we never really talked much. She had a funny way of talking, like she was talking through her own depression, but at least she liked Jimmy Carter. I did too. One day, a regular school day like so many before, we had sex education class. This was led by Brother Clement. Before we get into the sex ed lesson, though, I need to explain this teacher a bit. Brother Clement was a gentle man, with a warm voice and a friendly demeanor. He spoke softly and was probably the nicest recess-attending teacher there. He smoked a pipe during recess. This was completely fascinating to us young prepubescent boys. It smelled wonderful, and the smoke would bellow out of him and fly away into the windy afternoon air. I remember that he had to keep lighting it again and again because it kept going out. The wind seemed to prevent him from enjoying it, but he persevered. That would be his greatest challenge during recess. It distracted him from watching us kids. I think I even heard him cuss about the wind one day. The girls didn't seem to care about the pipe smoking. A few of us boys would hang around him and learn about smoking. He would pack it, tamp it down into the bowl, and then light it. The struggle of lighting it and keeping it lit on a windy day seemed to educate us a bit. It was the first pipe smoking I had seen up close. My father smoked a pipe for years when I was very young, but gave it up before I ever saw him doing it. The only smoke in our home when I was that young was on bridge night in our home. Lots of smokers and lots of smoke in our house. Big, thick, glass-sculpted ashtrays and bowls of peanuts littered our home on those bridge nights. My sister and I were always ushered off to bed before the games began. Brother Clement showed us how it was done. We liked him for being friendly and open with us, and showing us his little habit. He made us feel comfortable with the idea of adulthood. Later that year, he stopped bringing the pipe to recess, and we asked him why. He said he was asked not to smoke around us kids. We were all crushed just a bit. I think we needed it more than him. Then one day he gave us the sex education class. The boys had a separate class from the girls at first. In the boys we watched a few film strips about growing up, a boy, into a man, in a world of temptation. We never laughed so hard. We were highly entertained by the films and the subject matter in general. I think it was so funny to us because it was the first time most of us had learned or heard such things coming from such prim and proper adults as those who raised us and taught us. Suddenly, we were hearing graphic words and ideas. It was a bit of a shock, and kids tend to deal with that shock by finding humor in it. At least that's the psychology I have deduced from it, and college psychology as well. The films showed illustrated versions of young men, and in particular one young man who was supposed to be the subject of the issue, which could be any young man, including you. So we watched and listened and giggled, and at one point, one of the guys in my class said, "Come on, some of us want to learn about this. Shut up." I couldn't believe that was one of my fellow classmates actually taking this stuff seriously. Okay, I thought, I'll pipe down. This was before AIDS was a topic and before drugs got intertwined with sex and conversations in school. Brother Clement kept a handle on things by stopping the film often to quiet us down. He didn't seem to understand that we would find it entertaining. When the film was over, we heard Brother Clement speak at length about our bodies. You'll eventually find that if you touch yourself in the crotch area, you may become aroused. You may find yourself wanting to touch and play with that area often. Don't. That's called masturbation, and it's a sin. God doesn't want you playing with your body like that. That's for going to the bathroom and having sex with your wife after you're married. But now you will be tempted to play with your private parts, so there are ways of stopping yourself from doing that. First, take a cold shower. Now this one stumped me. Take a cold shower? Is he serious? Does he mean that if we want to jerk off, we should take our clothes off in the bathroom all alone and take a shower? Of course, a cold shower is a misnomer if you're not actually going to get into the cold water. What good is that? No one in their right mind actually takes a cold shower, I thought. So this is not a valid solution. But more than that, it seemed like a way to get into the mood, not out of the mood. Our misbehavior in that class bothered Brother Clement, but there was something else that bothered him at the time. He spelled it all out, too. I know you young people have lots of little words you use to describe these parts we're talking about today, like dicky and pee-pee, and they're just awful. Don't say those words. They're wicked, sinful words. They're evil. He actually got visibly angry at those words as he said them to us. He had a hang-up with immature, youthful language. I thought surely he'd be more upset if we just said the words we heard in the films, and in other classes, or in the lunchroom, or in church. We learned a lot about him that day, even if we didn't learn much about sex. One good use for that school came about each October. Our school held a yearly bazaar in and around our classrooms. They still do. Before Bazaar Weekend, the staff at the school would pull out the wooden stands and other equipment for the bazaar and lay them all out all over the quadrangle on the ground. We were told to avoid these things and not to trip over them. It was the standard precursor to Bazaar Weekend, which thrilled us to no end. Finally, we'd have that yearly chance to act like real kids in our school. We treasured those moments. During the bazaar, a lot happened. Dark green parachutes were used as tents above everything in the quadrangle. The biggest game, of course, was bingo, and hundreds of people would play that at the dozens of tables set up in the middle of the quadrangle. There were booths and counters outside each classroom, and inside each classroom would be things like a bake sale, a doll sale, and a blackjack room. The first grade classrooms were used as plant sale rooms. Those rooms came alive with bright green plants in huge numbers. I thought it was very helpful to have more plants in our classroom to show respect for nature, but this was only for the weekend. A lot of gambling takes place at Holy Ghost bazaars, and in fact, that Catholic school was the first place that I learned how to gamble. It was almost institutionalized into their education system. They let anyone play any game. They gambled with money, a lot of money in total, but most for 50 cents or $1 ante. After bingo, the next largest and most popular form of gambling at those bazaars was blackjack. That always took place in front of and inside Mrs. Whedon's 8th grade classroom. There was seating for at least 100 people at that game, and I played it just about every year. I liked blackjack because it was easy to figure out and fast. I would saddle up to the table on the same hard metal chairs from the gym and plop down my stack of quarters. I remember being ahead by about $5 at the most. It was easy to play, and I learned about human psychology from playing it. Many adults brought their cigarettes and beer with them to gamble. And it was a total mix of adults and kids and elderly folks. Another popular gambling pursuit was the over and under table. Craps, basically, but the dealer throws the dice instead of the player. The table is high, so I wasn't able to even see the game until I was in the 6th grade. It was one big table that had a high wall of protection around it, at about elbow's height to the average adult there. I was just able to peer over it down onto the game at the time. I watched and learned, and discovered that the biggest winnings and the biggest losses occurred there with that game. We could throw down our money on one number of several. It was called over and under because most people just bet on over 7 or under 7. The most common bet was $1, so it was the big time for me. Young as I was, my money was more than welcome there. I actually won big at a game one year. It was called Pot of Gold, and it was basically what scratch-offs are today. For 50 cents, you get this little ticket that has numbers on it. Folded and sealed out of view, you'd pay and get your ticket, and you'd have to open it by tearing off the folded seal. For 50 cents, you'd get this little ticket that has numbers on it, folded and sealed out of view. You'd pay and get your ticket, and you'd have to open it up by tearing off the folded seal. Then you'd see a number inside, and if that number matched one of the numbers on the wall above the person working that booth, you'd win a corresponding dollar amount. I played about $2 worth when I finally won. It was quite easy, too. I won $50. For a kid in the 6th grade, that's a hell of a win. Quickly, I ran to my mother, who was playing bingo at the time, and I announced my win to her. She asked me what I was going to do with it, and I looked around, and my eyes were immediately drawn to the over and under table. So off I went. I played over and under for about 10 minutes, and it was all gone. Oh well, I thought easy come, easy go. Kids can think like that without much problem, because kids don't have to pay bills. It did bother me a bit, though. If I could lose that much money in that small amount of time, then I could lose a lot more if I wasn't careful. But who were these people setting up games where a person could lose so much so fast, and where was that money going, I thought. Every few hours, a couple of armored truck security people would go to all the booths and pick up cash. I watched them do this at several booths, and it occurred to me that the bazaar was a big money-making operation. The money was supposed to go to the church, but I didn't think the church was hurting for money. It went to the school as well, but same thing. It was a private school, and it didn't seem poor to me. For the bazaars, the 7th grade classroom, 7-2 we called it, the physical science class, it was turned into a coffee shop every year. They took away all the jars of dead animals that normally surrounded the room and replaced them with cookies and cakes and all kinds of other goodies. A big coffee urn sat on the long table in the middle of the room. This was where we had science classes in the 7th grade. I hardly recognized the place when I walked in. One year I walked in to get something to eat, and Jimmy was in there already. Grr! He pranced around the room like a little child, though he was grown up more by then. I remember throwing my head in my hand and thinking, why? I can't believe this guy hung around me so long. He brought down the intellectual level of the room so fast like that, and the bazaar volunteer ladies watched and egged him on. I wondered how he was allowed to advance in the grades over the years. I decided not to get something to eat after all. During the 6th grade, we were all at the right age to start going to confession. This was one of the required sacraments that all Catholics are supposed to do on a regular basis after you get that old. Our church's confessionals were built into the sides of the center section of the church, and there were 4 sets of them. 2 confessionals, each with a small door on either side of the slightly larger center door that the priest used. We had 2 options at that church for confession. We could go to the traditional style of confessional where you kneel and you can't see the priest and he can't see you, or we could go to the relatively new style, which was behind the other confessional door, which was face-to-face with the priest, and you go to sit in a comfy chair the whole time. Of course, I always chose to sit. Any more kneeling and I was going to double over. My knees hurt. We spent way too much time on our knees in prayer, and the pain was entirely too acceptable to our school. Pain was indeed an integral part of being a Christian for me and all of my classmates.